Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America. Episode 23, Leisler's Rebellion. Last time we looked at the Glorious Revolution in England, when James II was overthrown by an invasion from the Dutch Republic by William and Mary, and how that event led to the downfall of the short-lived Dominion of New England. A rebellion in Boston had overthrown the Dominion, and eventually, the colonies were restored to their former positions, albeit Plymouth was annexed by Massachusetts, and Massachusetts was forced to accept a new charter which curtailed its independence. Today, we're going to look at the fall of the Dominion as it played out in New York. New York had only been an English colony for a little over 2 decades since the conquest of New Netherland in 1664. It started out as a proprietary province controlled by the king's brother James. James was no fan of representative government, and he was very reluctant to give New York an elected assembly, even though all the other English colonies had one. He was finally convinced to do so in the early 1680s, but he soon changed his mind after becoming king. Now that he was in charge, James decided to pursue a policy of centralization in the colonies. Or really, he decided to accelerate what was already starting to happen. In New England, that meant the creation of the Dominion. In New York, that meant reversing course on self-rule. New York's new assembly had sent him a constitution for his approval, the Charter of Liberties and Privileges. James had approved it, but he never sent word of his approval back to New York. He had a different plan now. Instead of being given a liberal charter, he would instead join New York and New Jersey to the Dominion of New England, creating a mega-colony, which would hopefully be much more obedient and easier to defend. The Dominion was less of an imposition in New York than among the Puritans of New England. After all, New York was pretty used to being ruled without an assembly or much popular input at all. The same merchant oligarchy that had controlled the colony since before the English takeover effectively remained in power. Plus, they were given considerable leeway to keep their own laws in place for the time being, since conditions there were so different than in New England. And New Jersey was so far away from the rest of the Dominion that residents there could pretty much do as they wished anyway. In any case, New York and New Jersey had only been annexed to the Dominion for less than a year before the revolt in Boston broke out, so the Dominion had barely had time to get settled there before it was overthrown. Now, although the Dominion was nominally a single province, it was so large that Governor Edmund Andros, who was stationed in Boston, had appointed a lieutenant governor, Francis Nicholson, to rule in New York. But as yet there wasn't much of a government there. You had Nicholson, yes, but the council serving under him was dangerously understaffed. Some of the councils had gone to serve in Boston, while other men who had been offered a position on the council had declined to serve. As a result, there were only 3 councilors there to help Nicholson govern. Beyond them, the old governing apparatus was more or less kept in place, so there was basically no one in the colony who had any loyalty specifically towards the new Dominion government. And when, in April 1689, word of the revolt in Boston reached New York, about a week after it happened, there was trouble almost immediately. Unsurprisingly, the first unrest came from the Puritans living on Long Island. The Puritans there had never liked being a part of New York. They'd rather have been ruled by Connecticut, and they'd always been at the forefront of pushing for greater self-rule. When they heard about the events in Boston, some of the Long Islanders released a statement basically calling for the same thing to happen in New York. And within New York City, people were starting to grow suspicious of Lieutenant Governor Nicholson. They were worried that the Dominion officials had Catholic sympathies and might try to turn the colony over to the French or something like that. They had been appointed by a Catholic king, after all, and the government had been suppressing news of events in England, in a doomed attempt to keep people calm. In fact, the colony was being swept by waves of paranoia. Their fears were unfounded, but that's never stopped a good bout of paranoia. So within a few weeks, the central government in Boston had been overthrown, the Puritans of the colony are in a state of near revolt, no one trusts Nicholson, and Nicholson doesn't have enough loyal men to control New York. Not a great position to be in. The lieutenant governor called together as many leaders in New York as he could to help serve the government, but really he was flailing around with few good options. One of the leaders he called on was a merchant named Jacob Leisler to serve as a captain in the militia. Leisler was a German who had come to New Netherland a few years before its conquest as a soldier for the Dutch West India Company. He remained in New York as a merchant, quickly becoming one of the wealthiest men in the colony. Anyway, it didn't take long for the revolt to finally come, just a few more weeks. On May 30th, an argument between Nicholson and a militia officer over some minor issue got extremely heated. According to David S. Lovejoy, quote, "It ended with the governors threatening to pistol a militia officer, and an excited shout that he would rather set fire to the city than put up with more insubordination." Unfortunately for Nicholson, exaggerated rumors about his remarks spread through New York City, and the next day the militia revolted against him. In no time at all they took control of the town and ousted Nicholson. After a few days, Jacob Leisler became leader of the rebellion, and so it would be known in history as Leisler's Rebellion. Nicholson fled to England, leaving Leisler in charge, although his authority was hardly unquestioned. Unlike in Boston, there wasn't the sort of social cohesion that could hold things together even in the face of potential anarchy, and so things went much less smoothly. Like in Boston, the people of New York formed a committee of safety to govern in the meantime, although this committee was elected rather than self-appointed. The committee voted to keep Leisler in charge for the time being, with them as a de facto executive council. In general, they kept things running, but they by no means had the support of everyone. In particular, Albany, the second largest city in New York, refused to recognize Leisler's government. They acknowledged William and Mary as their sovereigns, but not Leisler. I think they just saw what he was doing as an illegal usurpation of power. He and the Committee of Safety did what they could to increase their control, firing officers who didn't support them and so on, but New York remained unsettled. They sent word to London of their revolt, but very unfortunately for them, the representatives they sent were much less capable than Increase Mather was for Massachusetts. One of their agents was just out for himself, while the other, according to Lovejoy, was, quote, an ignorant, pretentious man who made a very poor impression at court and doubtless did more harm than good to the rebels' cause. As a result, New York made no progress in having its rebellion recognized or in securing a new charter from the king. Leisler declared himself lieutenant governor anyway, on a flimsy pretext, and replaced the Committee of Safety with a normal council of 8 men. The first big problem they faced was raising money. Leisler was reluctant to call for an assembly, but to impose taxes without the approval of a legislature would have been contentious to say the least, especially given his dubious legitimacy. So instead, Leisler did something equally dubious. During the brief period when New York had had a representative assembly, that assembly had passed some laws to raise taxes. Leisler just acted as if those taxes were somehow still in effect, despite all the changes to government that had occurred in the meantime. That didn't make anyone happy either, but the government needed money, so oh well. Leisler's fellow merchants were especially unhappy with these new taxes, but Leisler felt that he had no choice. One consequence of the Glorious Revolution was that England went to war with France, which meant that the English colonies in America were at war with the French in Quebec. And in order to fight the French, Leisler would have to persuade or force all of New York to recognize him. All of this would cost a lot of money, which he realized even if the merchants refused to see the bigger picture. At the top of Leisler's to-do list was the retaking of Albany. Albany had set up its own government to deal with the power vacuum, a convention of the leading civil and military officials in the city. They were closer to Quebec and more vulnerable to French attack, but rather than submit to Leisler in exchange for assistance, they managed to talk nearby Connecticut into sending them some troops instead. Leisler sent his own force up to Albany to try to persuade them and or cow them into submission, and the two sides nearly fought. However, Leisler's men were dissuaded from attacking thanks to the presence of Iroquois warriors who'd been enlisted to help defend the town. The French took advantage of this disorder. They sent a raiding party of 200 French and Indian soldiers to attack the nearby town of Schenectady, slaughtering the inhabitants. Many in Albany blamed Leisler for the massacre, for dividing the colony thanks to his usurpation, but they now felt that they had no choice but to grudgingly submit. And with Albany brought to heel, Leisler finally controlled the whole province. He now felt secure enough to call for an assembly, so elections were duly held under New York's old charter. This was yet another constitutionally questionable move, but the leaders of New York were reaching for whatever scraps of legitimation they could find in absence of word from King William. The assembly raised taxes considerably, which no one particularly liked, of course, and the government just seized goods deemed necessary for the war effort. They also voted to end the flour monopoly of New York City. Previously, farmers were legally required to bring their flour to the city to be processed and baked into bread, which gave the merchants of the city a big economic advantage at the expense of the farmers. Ending the monopoly may have been sound policy, but it was guaranteed to turn the merchants against Leisler even further. And in general, he was developing a reputation for arbitrariness and paranoia. He had a number of his opponents arrested on charges of conspiracy against him. And he wasn't able to maintain order. For instance, at one point a few dozen merchants accosted him and his men in the street. A scuffle broke out, but the merchants were driven off. But when the news spread to the countryside, farmers loyal to Leisler came to the city and rioted for a day until they were talked into leaving. Later that year, a group of Long Islanders even raised a force of 150 men in revolt. So not only was he behaving autocratically and unreliably, he wasn't even getting the job done. Needless to say, none of this helped with his popularity. Opponents of Leisler's rebellion painted it as an uprising of the poor against the rich, which was a typical tactic to discredit these sorts of revolts. It was commonly thought at the time that for a revolt to be justified, the rich had to participate, not just the poor, in a cross-class alliance against true tyranny. If it was just the poor, things were sure to descend into mob rule and chaos. In fact, Leisler's supporters did often come from a lower class than his opponents, although that didn't mean they were poor, just that they were sometimes artisans and bakers and so on, instead of merchants. For that matter, some of the rich supported Leisler as well. Not only that, Leisler himself was rich, although that fact was dismissed because he still had a low-class background. Just one more problem he was failing to deal with. And on top of all that, the war effort turned out to be a total, humiliating failure. That raid on Schenectady had been part of a larger French attack against the English, and there had been massacres in New Hampshire and Maine as well. This was enough to convince all the colonies of the need for some sort of joint action against the French. Leisler called for a Congress of the colonies to meet in New York in April 1690. He sent invitations not only to the New England colonies, but also as far south as Maryland and Virginia, although the Chesapeake colonies weren't able to send delegates or to contribute much. Rhode Island also didn't have time to send a delegation, but they did raise some money. While this meeting was being assembled, Massachusetts sent a fleet up north to Acadia, basically the part of the coast just north of Maine, which at the time was controlled by France. It was led by a man named Sir William Phips, who would go on to become the first royal governor of Massachusetts. Phips had been born a poor shepherd, but after an apprenticeship as a ship's carpenter, he rose to become a captain and then a successful treasure hunter who recovered valuables from sunken Spanish ships in the Caribbean, making him one of the wealthiest men in New England. He had no military experience, but his experience at sea recommended him for the position. It was a good call. The expedition was a quick success. They sailed to Port Royal, the main fort in the region, and caught the French unawares. The French surrendered without a fight, and the English even took Acadia's governor as a prisoner. With this new territory apparently claimed for England, the Puritans began to dream about expanding their lands even further north. But first there was the expedition against Quebec to attend to. The Congress of the Colonies had finished. We don't have records of the proceedings, but we do know it was decided to launch a two-pronged assault on the French, one by land and one by sea. The land expedition was led by Fitz-John Winthrop, grandson of Governor John Winthrop of Massachusetts and son of Governor John Winthrop the Younger of Connecticut. The goal was to capture the fort at what is now Montreal. This campaign was a total disaster. Massachusetts was busy doing its own thing, and none of the colonies further south had sent any troops, so it wound up being a joint mission of just New York and Connecticut. They were unable to get support from the Iroquois, and New York sent less than half the troops promised. A smallpox epidemic had broken out. The logistics and planning were entirely unsatisfactory. After 3 weeks marching north, Winthrop decided that it was hopeless, and so he ordered a retreat, and that was that. The English had defeated themselves. The sea expedition did no better. This was a joint operation between Massachusetts and Plymouth, again led by William Phips. The goal here was to take Quebec City, the other main French settlement. They managed to put together a force of 2,300 men, but the expedition was otherwise ill-equipped and ill-prepared. They took too long in getting to their destination, and the governor had had enough time to enhance the fort's defenses. With the failure of the land expedition, he could also focus all his attention on defending against the fleet. The English landed their troops near the town and fought some preliminary skirmishes against the French, but no one had the heart for a real assault on a well-defended fort, and so they soon retreated, scurrying back to New England before winter set in. Several ships were lost at sea. Only 30 men had been killed in the fighting, but a full 1,000 died from smallpox and shipwreck. And that was that. 2 big, very expensive expeditions that came to absolutely nothing and did nothing to help defend the English colonies. Total disasters. And for that matter, the New Englanders didn't even keep control of the land in Acadia they'd taken for all that long. They'd never really had the manpower to occupy the region, so it fell back into French hands when the war ended. Although the French had a much smaller population than the English, they augmented their numbers with Indian allies more than the English did, and unlike the English, they operated as a single political unit. This gave them a considerable edge against the English, who by all rights should have easily overrun Quebec. So the French will stick around for a while to come. Bad news for Jacob Leisler. Throughout all this, the government back in England has been ominously silent about what to do with New York. Well, actually, King William had appointed a new governor for New York all the way back in 1689, just a few months after the rebellion got started. However, his nominee, Colonel Henry Sloughter, was tied up by affairs in Europe and he didn't set sail until 1691. Finally, some legitimate authority. Before his arrival, one of his officials landed in New York to take command in advance. He demanded that Leisler surrender control, but Leisler refused and retreated to the fort along with a few hundred loyal supporters. He was convinced that this was some sort of conspiracy against his government, rather than something ordered by the king. The standoff lasted for 6 weeks. It was basically a siege. Both sides came to suspect the other of preparing an attack. At some point things descended into violence, though it isn't clear who shot first. Leisler's men killed a half-dozen people outside the fort, and some men died when a cannon exploded. But then, finally, Governor Sloughter arrived. Leisler tried to negotiate a surrender, but the governor refused to negotiate with someone who had no actual power, and so Leisler remained in the fort for 3 more days until his increasingly uneasy men surrendered themselves, abandoning him to his fate. Leisler was then promptly arrested and tried with rebellion and murder, along with 9 of his men. Most of them were convicted and sentenced to die. The governor wanted to delay the executions pending instructions from England, but Leisler's enemies pushed him to act quickly. New elections had been held, and they now controlled the assembly. Some of Leisler's allies had been elected as well, but they had been forbidden from taking their seats. So now, both the council and the assembly were back in the hands of the old merchant elite. With all this pressure against Leisler, the governor finally relented. Leisler and 1 other man were hanged on May 16th. The other convicts were eventually released. Poor Leisler. I suspect he was just outmatched by the job rather than a dictator in the making, but who knows? Given how much better the rebellions went in the other colonies, it's not hard to place a lot of the blame on him. New York was more divided than many of the other settlements in America, but there was no need for things to go so far. It was just paranoia and mismanagement. By the way, while all of this had been happening in New York and New Jersey, things remained calm, like when a tsunami in deep water barely makes a ripple. Once the Dominion was overthrown, it was very easy for them to go back to the way things were before, without needing to start a rebellion themselves. Anyway, with Leisler's rebellion officially ended, along with Leisler himself, the assembly got to work putting the colony back on track. The most important thing they tried to do was get King William to give them a charter. Since New York was a royal colony, its government existed at the whim of the king, but if they got a charter, then it would be much harder for the king to make arbitrary changes within the colony. So to that end, the Assembly passed a lightly modified version of the Charter of Liberties and Privileges, which the First Assembly had passed back in 1683. That was the charter which King James had almost approved before reversing course at the last minute to create the Dominion of New England instead. This charter would permanently secure the right to an assembly, which would meet at least once a year, it would give New Yorkers all the rights of Englishmen, and so on. However, the Lords of Trade recommended that the king not approve the charter. They believed it was far too generous in the privileges it gave New York. William agreed. Despite the Glorious Revolution, the English government was still looking to increase its control over the English colonies rather than decrease it. And so New York was left without a charter. It maintained its assembly, but only thanks to the ongoing grace of the king. The government had legal backing, but only on an ad hoc basis. If the king sent over new instructions to his governor, then, in principle, the whole settlement could be upended at any moment. Still, politics in New York went back to normal. At any rate, things became much less dramatic. Leisler's faction would remain a player in local politics for a while, although for the time being they were out of power. So, that's the end of Leisler's rebellion and the end of the Dominion of New England as well. Let's step back for a moment and do a little post-mortem for the Dominion. Could the Dominion of New England have worked if it had been given more time? Hard to say. On the one hand, it was overthrown in both Boston and New York remarkably quickly, as soon as an opportunity presented itself. Plus, most of the other elaborate schemes for political re-engineering in the colonies were failures. Think of all the constitutions that didn't work out. On the other hand, what if the Glorious Revolution hadn't happened? What if there had never been some big event to take advantage of? Would the colonists have ever dared to try something so dangerous if they hadn't been reasonably sure that the new authorities in England would be at least willing to look the other way? I guess the answer is, who knows? It's not impossible to imagine the Dominion succeeding through sheer force of will given enough time. Maybe some military victories against the French and Indians to make the colonists see the Dominion as a necessity. Or maybe the Dominion could have survived, but only after being divided into two, with New York and New Jersey being split off again. I mean, they were practically being governed separately anyway. But the real point is not to speculate about unanswerable questions. The point is that, even if you could force the Dominion to succeed, you'd still have to force it. It was an unnatural imposition that cut against the normal way of doing things. All of the colonies really did have their own political cultures at this point, and they were all jealous of their independence. They were also jealous of their rights as Englishmen, which is why the loss of an assembly was felt so keenly. In fact, you could argue that it was the loss of an assembly even more than the consolidation of the colonies into one unit, which led to so much unhappiness and unrest. The Dominion plus an elected legislature likely would have had a much better chance of surviving, at least in my estimation. But that's not what happened, and nothing so ambitious would be attempted again. In any case, while the Dominion itself was a failure, there had been a big change in Massachusetts, as we discussed. It still retained much of its unique culture, to be sure, but in terms of government it was being brought into line with the other colonies. And in New York, the colonists now had an assembly. They may not have had a charter, but the assembly was here to stay for good. If Massachusetts had deviated from the norm by being more self-governing, New York had deviated by being less self-governing. Now both of them were doing things the standard colonial way, with an appointed governor facing off against an elected assembly. Between the pressure from the colonists to govern themselves and the pressure from the king to keep the colonies in line, this was a natural compromise position. And so it's no surprise that, over time, more and more of the American colonies were governed this way. It just fit. Next episode, we'll look at even more colonial rebellions caused by the Glorious Revolution, this time in Maryland and North Carolina. So join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. If you like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. You can also keep track of Early and Often on Twitter at EarlyOftenPod, or read transcripts of every episode of the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com. Thanks for listening.